Record. Hola José Ignacio, ¿qué tal? Hola Gastón. Hola, muchas gracias a todos quienes se están uniendo a esta sesión. Em, Bienvenidos a esta charla de hoy que va a ser dada por Thomas Weaver. Voy a comenzar presentándolo primero en inglés, perdón, en castellano, para después cambiar a inglés y hacerle el pase a Tomás. La charla se está grabando, así que solo como aviso va a quedar también subida después a la página web del Magíster. Entonces, para comenzar, voy a presentar a Tom. Thomas Weaver es el editor general de Arte y Arquitectura en MIT Press. Estudió Arquitectura e Historia de la Arquitectura en la Bartlett School of Architecture en Londres y obtuvo su doctorado por TU Delft en Holanda. En los años 90 y 2000 trabajó como editor en la revista ENI en Nueva York, para luego desempeñarse por 10 años como editor de AA Publications en la Architectural Association en Londres. Ha sido profesor en diversas escuelas de arquitectura, siendo la más reciente el Verlaine Center for Advanced Studies in Architecture and Urban Design de TU Delft, y ha dictado charlas y conferencias en distintas locaciones. So after presenting you, Tom, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this Zoom session, as we cannot welcome you here in person. Thank you so much for joining us, and well, we are all very much looking forward to hear you talk about object relations and well, anything that you want to tell us, really. So thank you, and welcome to Chile in this virtual way.
Welcome to Chile, and welcome to my apartment. Thanks so much, Gabby, for that introduction. I always sound so much better in Spanish, and apologies for my non-existent Spanish. And thanks for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to share my screen. Gabby, can you just give me a thumbs up? Does that look okay? Cool. And you can hear me okay, I'm guessing? Okay, double thumbs up. Okay, so this is not so much a kind of a lecture as a sort of show and tell, partly to describe a course I taught for a few years at the Balaga in Delft, a course called Object Relations. But it's also to use this faith in objects to present a kind of wider appreciation of architecture. So part of it is kind of almost memoir, but I'll try and keep the memoir bit suppressed. But I'm basically trying to kind of expand on the idea of object relations and make it a kind of credo. And actually, like most of the things I've done in architecture and in architectural education, object relations had its origins in a polemic or rather an attack on a conventional way of working. And more especially, it is really, in essence, an attack on my own architectural education. I spent the entirety of the 1990s and also a little bit of the 2000s studying architecture at undergraduate, graduate, master's, MPhil, and then PhD level. And what I realize now, much more than I did at the time, is that in each successive stage of this education, I was actually absorbing less and less architecture. And so the more expert I got, the less architecture I was reading or exploring. And at Princeton, where I started my PhD, this paradoxical situation was advertised by the fact that the things, or rather the objects I was studying, were ultimately not buildings or drawings, but philosophers. At that stage, nearly all French philosophers. And here they are. So we'd have Michel Foucault, Henri Lefebvre, Maurice Blanchot, middle left, Jacques Lacan, on the far right, Jacques Derrida, at the bottom, the kind of duo of Deleuze and Guattari, Bachelard in the bottom middle, and then Bruno Latour in the bottom right. I mean, frankly, I could have chosen any number of philosophers, but these were the kind of emblematic figures of the time. Now, at that time, in the sort of mid-90s, I really liked reading this material. And I like architecture precisely because it enables an understanding of so many subjects. In English, you'd call it a magpie discipline. It borrows nests from lots of different other subjects. And I still very much stand by Foucault's thinking in particular, and his notion that the history of the world is not a history of great men or great events, but it's a history of ideas. And then when my grandmother at the time asked me about what buildings I would look at, I would say very dismissively, Granny, architectural theory is so much more than just buildings. But at the same time, I must admit, I was getting increasingly exasperated by the devolution of architectural objects, or rather their abdication, that architecture was seen only as meaningful when read through another discourse. And so when I finished my studies and I was working at the AA School of Architecture, finally free to do whatever I liked, I tried to recover some of these more obvious objects in architecture and appreciate them for what they were. I should also say here, and this is kind of fundamental, that I am not an architect. And so the most obvious, the most appropriate architectural object, the building, was never available to me because I could neither design nor build a building. And as a critic instead, and a writer, editor, and teacher, I was therefore left with architectural representation, in a sense, images of architecture. And so the first of them that I really kind of started to explore, which I did with my great friend, Pedro Alonso from the Catholica, was Reyna Banham. At that time, and in a way still today, there was an obsession with post-war architectural thinking, with Banham very much in the center. And Banham then read through, one would then read environmental histories of architecture, or mechanical histories of architecture, or scientific ones, understanding Banham's ideas allegorically. Again, in my desire to return to the object, I wanted to simply look at this guy with a beard, dressed as a cowboy, riding a bicycle. And so I took this sort of image with Pedro and we kind of unpicked it. Or we started to look at the image itself. It was a famous photograph taken by Tim Street Porter, used on the cover of his book. And then Pedro and I remade the picture. And again, I'm only putting this up partly because this was my first experience of Chile. This was a workshop that I did with Pedro in Chile, and this is in the salt flats in the Atacama. And this is, in a sense, the Reyna Banham of Chilean architecture, or the sort of paterfamilias of Chilean architecture, Rodrigo Pérez de Arce. So we put him on Banham's bicycle and we rode him across a salt flat in a photograph taken by the same photographer. I then put Pedro Alonso on the same bicycle and he rode it. And then out of sheer narcissism, I also rode the same bicycle. So I didn't really want to engage in performance art, but suddenly architectural history or a recovery of objects, in this instance, the object of the bicycle, took on a sort of performance aspect. In a way, partly prompted by Banham, I then started to look at other images. Again, my object at this point was the image. And this was another, again, a contemporary image of the time, of the environmental bubble, a famous drawing that Banham produced and was published in the late 60s. And it's all over architectural histories, always showing Banham with his sort of sunglasses and his beard, occupying this sort of future house, a house so ephemeral that it's simply a bubble. But in a way, I was not interested in Banham, I was interested in the other guy. You know, who's this guy on the left? So, like a kind of detective, I sort of went into this image and trying to find out who these other objects were, these other people. And I discovered, when my thing advances, come on, PowerPoint. Okay, I'm going back out. I discovered that the other figure in the bubble was this guy, Francois Dallegray, who was a Canadian artist and an architect. And it was Dallegray who was actually sitting in the bubble with him, and Dallegray who lent Banham his body and then placed Banham's head on top of his own body. And I later discussed this at length in a book I did with Laurent Stolder and Alessandro Ponte. Later still, as I moved, again, looking always at images and trying to sort of really privilege a discussion on the objects of architecture. I should also say that this sort of way of thinking was fundamentally informed by this famous essay by Robin Evans, Translations from Drawing to Building, which sort of offers up the idea that the drawing is the original thing in architecture. It's the first thing, and everything subsequent to the drawing is basically a copy, including the building. So a building is merely a copy of a drawing. So I looked at this famous drawing, this domino frame, and commissioned articles on it and wrote about it myself. And then even belatedly remade this image, remade this drawing in physical form. My PowerPoint is very slow, I'm sorry. Sorry about this. He says as he presses the button, manic. Okay, one, hold on. Okay, I'm back. So we remade the domino frame as an actual building, and we built it at the Venice Biennale. This I did with a colleague from the AA, Valentin Bonches van Beek. And it was a very, very peculiar sort of phenomena, constructing what is a drawing. And when you stood in this object, it really felt like you were actually inside a drawing. More recently, and actually throughout my work at the AA, the other great object I've been obsessed by are the architects themselves. That when I was looking at Princeton at the philosophers, it wasn't actually Foucault who was presented or Lacan who was presented. It was Foucauldianism or Lacanianism. It was the philosophical idea of their works. Whereas I always liked the lives and the people behind these this architecture, and I very much like the idea of bringing biography and the idea of a life into architectural discourse. And so over the last 10 years, I've done lots of oral histories with architects, including this one that I did with Denise Scott Brown, where I worked with her and wrote, in a sense, an autobiography, which she then later presented. Now, of course, the object as a non-architect, the object, in the sense that there have always been basically two objects that have been presented to me in a dichotomy established by Victor Hugo, the object of the printing press and the object of the cathedral, as dictated by his famous formulation, "This will kill that." So the arrival of the printing press kills architecture, kills the building. This was a sort of a dichotomy that has always haunted me. You know, I want to preserve architecture, but I also realize that my medium is the printing press. My medium is the book and the journal. And so I want to keep these things going at the same time. So the simultaneity of both building and book. And so in the past, I've always presented the edifices, the things that I produced, as if they were buildings. So here's a pile of books that I produced at the AA. Or here's a pile of the journal that I produced within my work at the AA Files, which was a sort of project within a project. And actually for me, returning to the book and returning to the object, the thing that I've developed an obsession for is the frontispiece, or the emblem at the front of that book, that is somehow suggestive of the material that happens inside. So an image of architecture that is both literal, it's conveying literally what's inside the book, but it's also symbolic and allegorical. So it's more than just an image. It's containing within it ideas. Still a very slow computer. Going back down. So the idea of the frontispiece, again, is something that I started to investigate a lot, and I've done historical work on that. Again, it's the most sort of symbolic of all objects, of architectural objects, or literary objects. And of course, it's a tradition that is ripe in architectural treatises. So the famous architectural tomes by Cerrillos on the left, or by Palladio, are defined by their frontispieces. And I even then started to investigate the actual primitive hut frontispiece by Logier. The one on the left is the one that he used. And actually I found that there was another one on the right that was used in just English editions of the book, where the primitive hut is actually much less primitive. It's sort of more rugged, more sturdy, lets in less water. So again, I'm trying to find alternatives to representative figures for architecture. But increasingly, I was trying to think of what would be a better frontispiece, what would be my own frontispiece. My kind of love of classical painting, or the history of art, meant that I've often tried to think of what alternatives would be. So Bruegel's Tower of Babel would be an obvious, appropriate image for my own frontispiece for the architecture I do. This would be my own definitive object, an object that contains lots of other objects. Or more recently still, I've looked at this particular painting by Antonello of Saint Jerome in his study, a very, very famous painting that shows a man, a translator of the Bible, within his space, within a space. Again, a painting that I really like, and I feel it's so rich with motifs and emblems and allusions to architecture that, again, if I had to create my own book, this would be the frontispiece. My investigation into Saint Jerome's, like architecture, also revealed that it's a typology, Saint Jerome. There's lots of Saint Jeromes. So you find different versions of this painting across 300 years of the history of art. All of them are defined by a kind of space within a space, by a man surrounded by books, and always with this lion figure, because of the apocryphal story of Saint Jerome taking the thorn out of the lion's paw. Here are two others, slightly older medieval Saint Jeromes, but again, always with those key elements of the book inside the building, with the figure and the lion. Here's another. You can even somehow merge the two together. This is a famous one by Dürer on the left and by Cranach on the right. You can almost push the Saint Jeromes together and they create a sort of singular room with the two windows on either side. But ultimately, I think you could even abandon the space itself. This is a final Saint Jerome by Masaccio, where Saint Jerome does away almost altogether with the space and just simply carries the two things that define him: the book in his right hand and the building in his left hand. And both of them somehow have a kind of harmonious coexistence. But again, I think that one can try and find even better objects or more originary objects that would define a kind of architectural frontispiece. And over the last couple of years, my writing and some of my teaching has looked at Noah's Ark especially, and wondering why this hasn't been offered up as the first architectural object. Why do we have this strange primitive hut and not Noah's Ark? I mean, it's in the first book of the Bible. It is the first building, and it somehow defines everything. When you look into arks too, you can see that there are wonderful histories of drawing that, like this by Athanasius Kircher, that are wonderful drawings in themselves and displays of architectural taxonomy. So this is a drawing that shows the subdivision of the ark, how all the animals were arranged, and how one animal would eat another animal, and how they would be fed and processed. So it's a kind of factory. Or other images of arks, again, that show the ark as a kind of box, as a kind of industrial shed almost, a sort of 20th century object that's based on repetition and utilitarianism. You'd never guess this is an early 18th century object. This looks like a 20th century factory. Or again, the sort of blankness of this factory. So again, I think in the ark you can find one of the more appropriate emblems for architecture. Actually, John Soane even did this rather wonderful drawing of an ark, or he placed an English battleship in front of an ark, just to sort of play off the idea of scale. So when you look at it, architects are using the ark as a kind of modular, as a kind of reference, not simply a reference about arrangement and taxonomy, but a reference about form and proportion. Of course, one could even apply the idea of the boat, or architecture's relationship to the boat, to much more recent kind of reproductions of architecture and the avant-garde. This is Hans Hollein's very famous aircraft carrier in the landscape. One of the great architectural drawings, I think. That is, again, I feel it's another kind of ark. It's another kind of homily to the, so it's another primitive hut, but it's not primitive and it's not a hut. And actually, again, if we apply this idea of a kind of emblem for everythingness, the other kind of guiding figure to me would be Diderot and D'Alembert and their encyclopedia. So that is a book that contains everything, just like the ark contains everything. And in the first issue of the encyclopedia, Diderot actually produced this fold-out diagram of a tree. It was a tree of knowledge, and each branch of the tree contained another subset of that knowledge. So it's an incredible drawing. It folds out to the size of a kind of duvet or a sheet. But again, you can see how it's representative of a singular figure, in this instance, a tree that contains everything. So I'm obsessed by the idea of everythingness and yet the simplicity of an object that contains that. Of course, Diderot's own book was very much a demonstration of this, the idea of the part and the whole, and the way his book separated text on one side with a kind of the parts that make up that text on the right. Or where spatially he would introduce an industry that he was describing in his encyclopedia and reveal it in spatial terms, architectural terms, at the top of a page, and underneath it, he would reveal the parts that one uses to operate that industry. Again, this for me is emblematic of the way I very much like to work, showing architecture as a whole, pragmatic thing, but also as an assemblage of parts, more abstract parts. There's also a wonderful essay on the encyclopedia by Roland Barthes, where he uses the encyclopedia to somehow offer a kind of eulogy to the idea of the object. And he talks about how the encyclopedia practices what he calls a kind of philosophy of the object. and that by separating image from text, the encyclopedia, as he says, was committed to an iconography of the object whose power we enjoy today, since we no longer look at these illustrations with mere information in mind. So for me, this became a kind of perfect synthesis of my kind of Princeton, of that sort of 90s Princeton moment when we're only looking at ideas, only looking at philosophies, where we merge that with looking at physical things. We're looking at drawings, we're looking at buildings, we're looking at spaces. And we understand those spaces, not just materially, but allegorically, for carrying ideas within them. Actually, a better example, I think, than Diderot is an exact contemporary of Diderot, which is this wonderful map of Paris produced by a guy called Turgot in the 1730s. And this is this enormous drawing of Paris. And it's drawing all of Paris. The drawing itself was made up in all of these panels. And the thing is, in reality, is the size of a house. You know, it's a huge, it's a facade, it's a building in itself. And when you zoom in, it's all drawn in axonometric form. He draws every single building. He even draws every single tree, every single curve. Every element of an entire city is drawn. And I always think about this against the idea of the Nolly map or the Nolly plan. Architects for years and years and years have been eulogizing about Nolly, or making Nolly, in a sense, emblematic of architecture. But for me, this is a much more convincing, much more compelling, much more charming, lovable symbol of an architecture both of parts and of wholes. Well, lastly, as we kind of continue this survey through collective endeavors of everythingness, one would include also Aby Warburg, who produced in the 1920s this famous Nemesin Atlas, which was basically a series of boards that he decorated with postcards only. And he told the history of art or history of ideas through these boards, with each board being representative of a certain trope. So again, he removes the spoken word entirely, and it's told entirely through objects, entirely through images. And what's reassuring in some ways to me is that among many of his images that he loves are things that I love too. So there's one whole board that features Saint Jerome on the left. You can see him sort of down here, as well as each other board had a certain other character. One final one, again, just moving forward, another emblem of an idea of everythingness through its parts would be this famous photograph of André Malraux, laying out the pages of his book to the camera. It's very much a stage image. All of the pages are not facing Malraux, they're facing the camera. But it's for sure, it's a diagram of narcissism, of self-worth, but it's also a sort of a confident demonstration of the ability to contain lots of things within one thing. In this instance, the book. And in my work at the AA, I sort of carried all of these ideas with me, but the best demonstration of these ideas was in the magazine that I produced, AA Files, where I tried very, very much to kind of steer the course of architectural history away from a sort of abstraction in terms of kind of philosophical thinking or theories, and tried to bring back the objects of architecture. So in the articles I edited and commissioned, I would really privilege some of these architectural forms and make it very clear right from the title pages that we're dealing with an essay about an architect, whether it's Hilberseimer, Malaparte, Dennis Lasdon, Joseph Albers, or through conversation, whether these are oral histories with these figures, with Hasegawa, with Peter Eisenman, Kevin Roach, or projects that are solely, articles that are solely about specific architectural projects, about a drawing, about a particular building, a particular scheme. I didn't like architecture. I like abstraction and I like theorization, but I like that to emerge out of the physical thing. So again, these are all sort of emblems, like frontispieces in a way, to an idea of the objecthood of architecture. That didn't, of course, allow other disciplines to appear, disciplines like classics, like fashion, like history of science, like psychoanalysis. But again, I made these things come after you reveal the object, not before. And I tried even to do this graphically. A Files observed this sort of more conventional old graphic model where you separate text from image. Again, a bit like Diderot did. You have one full image, full page of just images, one full page just of text. The two are always in dialogue with each other. You don't integrate the two things together. And when I'd be lecturing on the work that I'd be doing in A Files, I'd again constantly try and find other kind of heroes who would defend this idea. And another kind of classical one would be Goethe, who had this famous line from his Italian journey, where he says that he'll never rest until I know that all of my ideas are derived not from hearsay or tradition, but from my real living contact with the things themselves. So you have to really physically experience objects, things, in order to then discuss them. So that the primacy of a kind of material engagement with stuff. Or as I would sort of say to my authors in A Files, I think that you can take that idea and actually it can inflect in the way you write. I very much like this poem by Wallace Stevens where he says that description is revelation. And again, I very much like writing that is simply describing. I don't like writing that begins by interpreting or analyzing. I like someone to first of all describe something and then later analyze it. Whereas academic writing usually does it the other way around. You often begin with interpretation and then you apply that interpretation to some poor, unsuspecting object. Again, I want to flip this around. And I did this, I applied this method to all of the texts that I edited in A Files, giving real privilege to the objects, to description, and using the graphic design of the magazine to sort of play to these things. Here's a famous piece by Pedro that I commissioned and Hugo on the KPD system in Chile. Or here's a great piece that Gabriela wrote for me on Palladio. Or another piece on Appia, again, always beginning off the theme. So the very first line of this piece, in one of the few surviving photographs of Appia, the scenographer appears seated at his drawing board. So the writer, very first thing they're doing is simply describing an object. Or you can even end a piece with a description of an object. This is a great piece on Schinkel that ends with a description of this painting. And I very much use the physical printing and the physical design of A Files to kind of promote these ideas, being very precise about the colors of the magazine or the variable colors of the magazine. Or as much as possible, trying to introduce things beyond the page. So I have a sort of almost dangerous addiction to fold-outs or to inserting large things within small things. So I place panoramas in the magazine, or even larger fold-outs of drawings. Architectural drawings, by definition, are nearly always landscape form, and I want to see them as big as possible, which means you have to fold them in. But I also like that sense of a kind of present, of that kind of sense of suspense you get when you unfold something. Or I did even more elaborate things. This was a piece on Le Corbusier's design for a stadium, which was predicated off these sort of fins. So I placed one of the fins in the magazine, like a pop-up. Or we even did cutouts in the page so that you approach the article in the magazine exactly as you would physically approach the building. So I wanted to make the act of reading akin to the act of visiting a building. Or I even inserted a letter. This is Gio Ponti, the Italian architect, famously wrote lots of letters. So I inserted one of his letters into the magazine. But of course, the irony is that he didn't write his letters, he drew them. So it's a drawn letter where he's inviting someone to breakfast with an egg. Or lastly, within the magazine itself, I tried to fold in an actual building into the magazine. This was a piece about Chinese architecture and Chinese neoclassical architecture, how enormous, how stupidly enormous it was. So I folded in the largest piece of paper I could. So again, I would argue this is almost an emblem. This would be another kind of primitive hut. This is the emblem of what I wanted to do. I wanted to fold actual architecture in to my magazine. I then so throughout my work at the AA, I'd also try and teach as much as I can. And I was teaching at the AA at the undergraduate level and graduate level. But in the last years at the AA, I also was teaching at the Berlage, which is a really interesting school. It's a slightly AA-ish school in Holland. It was an independent school, and then it became brought under the wing of TU Delft. And Holland and England is not so far apart. I could fly door to door in 40 minutes. So rather kind of lavishly, I could teach there 1 day a week and just commute there. And through my discussions with the director of the Berlage, Salomon Frausto, he liked the kind of work I was doing on the magazine and AA and my kind of commitment to objects. And so we developed a course that was predicated of objects. So I'm just going to very quickly run through the kind of structure of that course now. This was a course for post-professional master students. So they'd already got MAs. They were all qualified architects, but they wanted another, it was a 1.5-year course, just kind of reacquainting themselves with the academy, with thinking and imagining and writing. And as a post-professional master's, it had to have a theory course. So I was the person teaching theory. But I really did not want to teach theory around a seminar table, just by keeping them inside for 3 hours every week. And Holland is a sort of very compressed country with a very good public transport system. I instead structured the course whereby each session we went and looked at something. We went and looked at an object. Each of them was basically informed by a kind of Dutchness. So the first one was on drawing, and we went to look at drawings by Aldo van Eyck and Piet Blom and Herman Hertzberger, the kind of structuralist Dutch architects of the 50s and 60s. Again, this is following from the kind of credo of Robin Evans, begin with a drawing, because the drawing is the very first thing. Everything is subsequent to the drawing. So the very first object is always a drawing. And then I would assign to my students certain drawings so that they would present those drawings live in the archive. And then we do little writing exercises, initially always through description, where they would have to write small, very, very small chunks of text about their drawings. After the drawing, we then did building. We did a number, I've taught this course for 4 or 5 years, and we did different buildings each time, but I wasn't afraid to do very, very obvious buildings. I mean, sometimes I don't think that one always has to find the original thing. I think finding the cliched thing or the very unoriginal thing is interesting. So I took them to the most unoriginal thing of all, the Rietveld Schroeder house in Utrecht, which is actually a really interesting building. And I think it forms part of the poster that Gabby produced for this talk. This is another version. This is another object within the Rietveld Schroeder. And on all of these trips, I would always text Gabby with to see if she could guess which objects they were from. This is the sink in the Rietveld Schroeder. Rem Koolhaas has a really dismissive line about the Schroeder. He calls it a gypsy caravan. You know, it's basically a piece of kitsch. But actually, it's more interesting than that. Okay, I'm getting the freeze again. Let me reboot it. And then after building, we did painting. Again, as you can probably tell, I use paintings in my lectures and in my teaching a lot. And I like that crossover between history of art and history of architecture. Again, with the painting, I went with a very obvious example. This is Vermeer's view of Delft, partly because they were all coming from Delft. It was also because they were all international students and I wanted them to sort of think about the place they were in. So we would look at this painting very, very closely and speculate on all of its many aspects. And then later we would stand in exactly that spot where the two women are standing and consider the view again. Of course, the painting is in the Moritz house, so we would look at other paintings at the same time, including the famous Goldfinch. I mean, when you're in an art gallery, you have to look at other things. We then looked at books and media. And again, I am nominally an editor. I don't want to overprivilege the book, so I put it a little later, but books are clearly fundamental. And it would nearly always be the Diderot and Dallaire, the encyclopedia. Delft has a wonderful library and it has first editions of the full encyclopedia. So we would look at them, we would look at the plates, look at how the drawings are made and really study them. In some of the exercises we did later, we would do pastiches of them and mimic these drawings. And then in 5, I wanted to again expand the horizon, to change scale a little bit. So instead of looking at small things within archival spaces, I wanted to look at big things. I wanted to look at the idea of landscape itself as a whole object. Holland is in a sense an artificial country. It was a country recovered from underneath the waves. So I wanted to look at a seaside place. This is the seaside west of Delft. So we would walk along this seaside terrain, walk along the threshold space between land and sea. And then on the same trip within The Hague, there's this famous, one of the only surviving panoramas, 19th century panoramas, that actually has a panorama of that same landscape. So after seeing it physically, we would then see it virtually, or 19th century virtually, in terms of this painting, and start to speculate on the ambivalences or the threshold in between these two things. Again, I like messing with the idea of what the object is. You know, what's the real object here? Is it the landscape, the beach you've just walked across, or is it this piece of literal sand in front of a panorama? Again, I like very much oral history and speaking to architects and speaking to art historians. And so as much as possible, I wanted to try and bring that into. And so we would also arrange meetings with figures. So we did oral histories with various critics and architects. This is Hermann Hertzberger, trying to teach my students as to how you can actually capture original lines by recording people, asking them about their work and their lives. And then lastly, I would wrap it up with a kind of a larger session within a place, and a place that somehow had lots of things within it. So one of the ones I would often choose would be this museum in the east of Holland, the Kröller-Müller Museum, which is a kind of sculpture park and art museum, and it has no roads, only bicycles. So the first object would be the bicycle itself, and then another object would be the landscape. It's set in this really rather spooky kind of almost beach-like landscape in the middle of Holland. And then we would look at some of the objects, the wonderful paintings in the collection, like this by Van Gogh, or we'd look at some of the sculptures, the Richard Serra sculptures, Donald Judd sculptures, pavilions by Rietveld, or by Van Eyck, or the building itself by Van der Velde. Very, very interesting building, the Kröller-Müller. There's also the ghost of other buildings. When the Kröller-Müllers commissioned the building from Van der Velde, Mies van der Rohe entered that competition, and he submitted his design by creating a model of the building he wanted to build, and he built the model at 1-to-1 scale. So this is actually a real model at 1-to-1. So it becomes like a ghost. It's like a kind of Moby Dick white whale that haunts Kröller-Müller. There's something very spooky about the place, but anyway. So there's lots of objects for the students to pick. And then later in a presentation, they would choose one of these objects and write about them. These are some booklets that I did with them from a previous place. This is a Homburg museum in Germany. Again, it's a sort of multifaceted museum that has architecture, art, people, lots of different objects to choose. And I liked the presentations to be collectivized, in the sense all given the same format. I have a certain fondness for the constraints, publishing constraints, you know, giving them a format, giving them a grid, giving them certain rules, black and white images, or always separating text from image, playing off the idea of the grid even by superimposing a grid on the page, and helping the students that way. I mean, the Berlage students are also very, very adept at these collective projects. And the result was really, really successful. It was also just, you know, heartening to just go on these trips with students. They clearly enjoyed the travel to these places, we would rent vans or cars or buses or bicycles. So that was very much part of the encounter with the object. So it's not just simply the almost abstract relationship you have with the thing, it's getting to the thing and getting back from the thing that's interesting. And now, just to sort of wrap up, I just wanted to take this into the kind of more recent realm of my work with MIT. This is the MIT logo. So I've been working with MIT from London throughout COVID. I basically started just before COVID. So I've had a difficult year and a half or so trying to commission books on art and architecture from my apartment. In a sense, I'm breaking all of my own rules. I can't see any objects. I can't physically, like Goethe would hate me. You know, I'm not there with the thing itself. But I have to produce these books. And I'm also trying to corrupt MIT at the same time, frankly. And just now, the very first books are coming through. So this is actually the very, very first book I've commissioned, and it comes out next week, actually. I just got one copy here. And it's a book about Yamasaki, the architect of the World Trade Center, but it's also a book about lots of other things. And actually within the book, this is the very first line of the book. I am a tyrannical editor, but I like first lines especially to be really carefully crafted. And in this first line, the author doesn't really know this. I was trying to smuggle into MIT a kind of manifesto for objects. So he's talking about experiencing the World Trade Center and how you could lie against them at night and just stare straight up them, and how they were like a kind of a road, looking up a road. And he says, you know, you could stand in the space between them where the air vibrated with silent energy, and imagine you were standing between the tines of a tuning fork. Clouds would catch on the upper floors as they passed over the city, subtly altering the weather. They were alpine, a pair of aluminium mountains. They induced vertigo. They exceeded haptic experience. They failed as buildings, but they were brilliant as objects. So again, it's a kind of anthem, a manifesto that I've snuck in there to MIT to the power of the object. So you always begin with the object. And then following Justin's book on Sound Future, the book that I'm just finishing right now, it'll come out soon too, is a book on geometry by a guy called Noam Andrews. And again, I'm trying to remind people about things, about drawings. And I'm doing this by basically, metaphorically, pointing a stick at people and poking them and saying, hey, look at this object. And I do that by having a picture of a man pointing a stick at an object. It's a book about geometry and about Dürer and early artists playing around with geometric shapes. But it has this weird trope that no one's ever written about before, which is a man, I'm afraid it is usually a man with a beard, sometimes naked, pointing a stick at a piece of geometry. So again, here's this wonderful one by Carliccio. Or here is the wider painting that I used on the cover by Pacioli. Fantastic painting. And actually I discovered belatedly that Warburg and his Nemesin Atlas also liked geometric objects. And in one of his boards of the Nemesin Atlas, he had this image on the top left of a kind of geometric shape within a shape, within a shape, within a shape. You know, a sphere within a pyramid, within a sphere, within a cube, within a sphere. And I realized actually that the author of the book also featured the same image. It's by Kepler. And so I said, hey, fuck it, let's just make this huge. So I have done an AA files trick with this image, and we've folded it in to the back, just again as a reminder of the power of objects. And then just lastly, things I'm working on at the moment is a return to the idea of the building. Actually, again, like I said, I'm no architect, I can't produce buildings, but I want to somehow recover that older model of books that are simply about one building. In the sort of 1930s, 40s and 50s, you get very, very boring books about Palladian villas or about country estates or castles that were simply leading you through these buildings. But I actually rather like the book that is only about one building. And so I've just commissioned 3. And the first of them is about the famous Vestigui apartment by Le Corbusier. And I found amazing material for this building through the author, Wim van den Berg. So that's what I'm editing right now, a book about a building. And almost certainly I'm going to use this image on the cover, which I've never seen ever before, but it's a drawing by Le Corbusier's office of the Bestigui. And then the other building I'm going to do is Liszczy's cloud iron project, this sort of weird futuristic project for a kind of future skyscraper. So again, it's going to be a book only about one building, nothing else. And then lastly, to sort of continue this sort of idea of the object and the building, the final thing I'm producing right now with MIT is a kind of series of detective stories that play off kind of pulp fiction books from the 40s and 50s, you know, slightly more than slightly salacious, trashy pulp fiction, small pocket books that have presented a mystery. And then I'm recoding that, and I'm going to create books where the building is a mystery that one has to then solve. So these books are going to be called Gumshoe. They're going to be tiny little pocket books. And I'm doing this with a great professor of architecture from Belleville in Paris, Françoise Fromenot. And the first one is going to be the mystery of the house of Dr. Koolhaas, of Rem's famous Villa de Alva. And then the second one will be on the Farnsworth house, or the revenge of Edith Farnsworth. Again, trying to sort of shake a otherwise very conventional university press and a very, very conventional academic discipline by bringing in architecture, by bringing in the objects. And that is it.
Thank you so much, Tom, for the lecture. Amazing lecture and amazing, the read through all these objects and places. I think we have a few minutes for questions, if you agree to them, if you're fine with them. So if anybody that's here, both from the masters or as guests, please just, if you want, you can just ask something, or maybe if you want, you can also write it in the chat and we can sort of read. And I mean, it's better if you ask them out loud. So if anybody, you can also, I guess, raise the hands here in the sort of using the Zoom tool for that.
Hi, hi Thomas. Thank you so much for your presentation.
I hope you asked the question. I love your submarine.
Thank you. Yeah, it's cool, a cool background. Well, you said that you always start with a description of the object, and also that the text is separate from the images. If text always comes separate, like what comes after, you know, the description, what's important, or what's the strength of this division between object and text for you?
Good question. For me, I think perfect texts have three things. They have description, and then they have a kind of contextualization. So first of all, you describe it. You say, hey, Renata, look at Renata's submarine behind her. And then I would talk about submarines and the idea of submarines, and in a sense, references. I might make reference to famous ones, or I might have quotations. So I'm sort of embellishing on the idea of submarineness. And then I think you can move into interpretation and analysis. What does it mean? You can take it into a different register. And I think that would be the fundamental dialectic, A, B, and C. That could be also within a paragraph, as much as it could be extruded into be the whole essay or the whole book. But I like it that way around. And again, if you look at most academic writing, it's completely the other way around. You're encouraged to write in a often rather pompous way about what something might mean. And then you apply that meaning to something. So PhDs or master's theses are always a big theoretical introduction. And then chapter 1 is object A, chapter 2 is object B, chapter 3 is object C, and then you do a conclusion where you repeat the introduction. So again, I like the idea of moving from the thing, and as you move away from it, you're bringing in wider ideas.
Thank you.
And you'd be amazed, Renata, I have to give that speech, not just to sort of 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, but to sort of, you know, Anthony Vidler, Kenneth Frampton, Rosalind Krauss. You know, they're like, what? Begin with the object? I'm like, hey, why don't you try describing that painting? It might be interesting.
Yes, as I was saying before to Tom, we're working in the masters with proposing these interactions with an archive of the former School of Architecture of the Universidad de Chile that was located in a faraway, in a peripheral area of Santiago. And so we have this task to react to the objects in the archive, and we just found out that the archive is a fiction. So we are sort of in a problem where we are looking for the object and the object is not there. So maybe, what shall we do, Tom, please?
I know this sounds bad, but you could play that to your advantage. You know, that you could, in a sense, you're not in the sense just describing the object, but you're creating an archive. Why it might be relevant to be contained and preserved and to be representative of something else. So it's also like Andre Malraux, it's a museum without walls, that you're free to create that future archive. And then the assignment is not just to highlight it, but why it should be kept. So I think it could be good. And then there's even the bigger project about what is the envelope? You know, there's an architectural project. What shape do we give this archive?
And as it is a former airport, you might get, if you come to Chile, you might get a nice opportunity for another sort of you on a bicycle picture. So you have to write that down.
It's in a disused airport, is it?
Yeah, it was the former airport before it moved to Pudahuel.
Is that the one that so that's only just moved, no? So the one that I know and have flown into, that is the archive, is it?
No. That's where, they are just making it bigger. They're in Pudahuel, but it used to be in what now is, it's within the circle, the Américo Vespucio Road, the circle road. So it's within the city right now. It's still peripheral in relation to where the school is now, but it's within Santiago. And Pudahuel, the current airport is still on the outskirts, but they're just making it bigger. And
but again, archives are interesting because they don't have a classical lineage. That libraries are classical, so you can think of great libraries, but archives are always somehow celebrated because they don't have any architecture. They're just boxes or their racking systems. So to give an architectural identity to an archive is a very relevant project, I think, as much as what's inside it.
Yes, we have a question from Daniel. If you want to.
Yes. Hi. Well, thank you very much, Thomas, for your lecture. It was very interesting. Well, I have a sort of weird, question. Is that, at least in my opinion, which is maybe not so, sound or robust, but it seems that architectural culture is currently nowadays focusing on objects from a not so distant past, but it's maybe shying away from contemporary objects. And I mean, the Domino House or the Barcelona Pavilion or any works from Van Eyck or the Smithsons or whoever, they are helpful in order to build arguments. Does it seem to you that maybe the objects of contemporary architecture are not carrying enough arguments? I mean, in a way that there's sort of a neoclassical climate where we look to the objects of modernism rather than contemporary architecture.
No, I think you're dead right. I think it's a obvious weakness, or I have an obvious weakness for historical precedent. And there isn't any discussion on anything contemporary. And I think that partly stems from the fact that the cultures I've been navigating, an American one and an English one, architecture is devolving as a discipline. You are lucky in that Chile is one of the few sort of really active architectural cultures. There is still an incentive to design something and build something and actually make it. But I think contemporary discourse is becoming almost a separate discipline. And I agree, I'd love to be able to move in and out, not just of historical precedent, but of contemporary things. But I'd love then for the contemporary practitioner to also move backwards too. That I really don't like schools of architecture where there's a hard line division between history or critics and historians and theorists and then design studios. I think the best places have a very dissolved line. And I mean, I've spent my time in American schools, in English schools, in Swiss and Dutch schools, and it's always a bit off. When I'm in America, I crave to be in Switzerland. I'm like, can someone design a building here? And then when you're in Switzerland, you're like, Jesus Christ, I can't listen to anyone talking about stairs anymore. Can someone read a book? Can someone give me an idea? And I think that and it works both in temporal terms too. Can someone talk outside of the contemporary moment or into the historical? And then equally, when you're in historical terms, you want to shake some of these historians and get them to talk about contemporary practice. So it's difficult. It's easier said than done. But I think it has to happen at the level of the school and then extrude out so that architects are used to opening up their designs for criticism as well as contributing to that debate, just as historians should be able to talk across a contemporary realm.
Thank you.
And just in response to what Ale is asking here on the chat, well, this is a project, the Interacciones con el Archivo Núcleo Cerrillos. It's a project that's led by one of the members of the masters, Cristian Gomez, and also Daniel has taken part of it. And it's about the School of Architecture that was located in Cerrillos for like some 20 years and then sort of moved in a sort of complicated way to where it is now. And so they're trying to rebuild this legacy or this history, and it's kind of tricky because there is a lot of different people like wanting to get over that the building and the memories. So it's a really interesting project that is now in the in the Centro Nacional de Arte Contemporáneo in Cerrillos and can be visited for, I think, for a month. So it just opened, and so you're all welcome. So Tom, if you can fly, and you can maybe get here after the quarantine and all that. I know it's not easy, but more than welcome. Steph raised, I mean, do you want to, yes?
Yes, I have a question, sort of general question maybe, but thank you first for your presentation. It was quite fun to look at a lot of the images as well as hear you talk about them. And I was wondering in regards to maybe your biography or timelines of the works you've done or context maybe, but in what way this could be also thought as a response to the sort of vastness of the internet during the 1990s. I mean, of the recentering of attention on an object as a narrative strategy to begin unpacking a sort of a rather large network of objects and ideas is something quite hard to find within the internet itself. It's like quite the opposite, right? It's like having some guidance as to what to see in things and how to start developing a sort of larger network of ideas. And that, in a sense, is editorial, like the guidance through the material. And I don't know, I was just thinking if in any way your work was a reaction or how did you at the time deal with that, or were thinking about maybe about this sort of new technological way of distributing information, maybe infinitely, and sort of centered on the vastness more than on one thing, and the narrative around one thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, but of course, I want both. I want one thing and I want vastness. But I think you're right that I hadn't thought about it before, that it is partly a reaction against that, the sprawling mass of the internet. And it's also more about that reaction that there seems to be no incentive, that surveying the sprawling mass becomes a kind of ritual, that it doesn't predicate itself off an incentive to bring it together. It's simply what you do every day by clicking on certain links. But for sure, my kind of credo is tied to a sort of analog condition of physically having to produce these things, these magazines and these books, and to physically see these things. So it is a kind of analog architecture, but I still think that one can do that digitally. I haven't found it yet. I mean, I think the PDF is actually a very uncelebrated thing, because it's actually a great thing, the PDF. And because the PDF does contain everything. It contains all of the colors and the fonts and the images exactly as you want them to be. But unfortunately, the digital industry doesn't always piggyback off the PDF. But I do have a resistance to that. And I do have a resistance to the idea that everything can just be perpetual or infinite, and that I like some kind of constraint. I like the moment when a project ends and you call it for what it is, or you announce it. You say, this is an arc, or you say, this is a tree, or this is a cloud. And then you go on to the next project. I don't like the idea of the perpetual. And I think so much of a kind of internet mythology is predicated off that idea of a kind of perpetual ritual. But it's back to Renata's question a bit at the end, that what happens at the end. I think maybe, I used to hate this as a kid when teachers used to say, that there's a sort of closing the loop at the end of any writing exercise where you have to sort of bring it all back. And I always tell my writers, I like writing to be a line. But Steph, that you're talking about a line, and I'm saying I hate it, but I do think there has to be a moment when you create something and it then becomes an essay or a book or a design, and ideally there is a thing that you're understanding through that piece of writing. It could be a section through a boat, it could be the boughs of a tree, it could be a tiny detail of a little drawing, but I like the idea of the microcosm existing alongside the macrocosm.
Maybe we can have one last question if somebody wants to pitch a book, maybe.
Sure.
It has to be on an object.
Or we could write.
What?
Or we could write a book on archives in airports.
Yes, definitely. Very interesting. Yes, I think, yeah, maybe more questions will come after we all process the 126 images, given with perfect timing, despite your PowerPoint's wish to sabotage you.
That's several points. That's it, Buster. No more.
I'm just going to talk without images, without objects. So yeah, so many ideas about the yes, like the thing itself and the collection of things, or all the things contained in that wonderful tree diagram by was it Diderot and D'Alembert, and so many ideas to maybe test the next time we write something or the next time we teach. So thank you so very much for the lecture and the conversation and all the images and all the ideas that you've left there for us to think about. Yeah, thank you so much for the time and the conversation. And
anytime, but invite me back anytime. I'd love to see the results of the workshop or the study of the course.
Yes, definitely. And as soon as everything gets a bit more normal globally, It would be so nice to fly you over and take you to that airport and maybe discuss in situ. No? Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you to all that joined us today, and we'll see each other soon, hopefully. And thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.